Episode 19, record-setting 26-mile freefall jump, Alan Eustace. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Alan Eustace. Alan holds the record for highest altitude freefall jump. On October 24th, 2016, he jumped from the stratosphere at an altitude of 136,000 feet, or about 26 miles. Alan was the Vice President of Engineering and Knowledge for Google and held many other executive roles at other high-tech companies prior to Google. He is currently retired and lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Let's go way back to the beginning. Were you fascinated in space travel as a kid?
Definitely. I mean, I grew up in Orlando, Florida. My dad was an aerospace engineer. He worked for Martin Marietta. So we were all things space pretty much all the time. We went to pretty much every launch. We would get in a 9-passenger station wagon and we would drive over to Cape Canaveral at the time and watch space launches. We had model rockets as kids. I think everybody that I knew wanted to be an astronaut at that time. So I've always loved space travel, the kinds of views and perspectives it gives, the teamwork, all that. I've always loved anything related to space.
So given your interest in the space program, obviously your aptitude for engineering, did you ever consider going the route of becoming a professional astronaut or even just working for NASA?
Yeah, the timing was bad. I mean, everybody I knew wanted to be an astronaut. All the kids, dreamed about being astronauts. I mean, it was I was born in 1956. So, when I was 10 years old, it was 1966. So we were pretty much about the time to where we were going to land on the moon, all the Apollo stuff. But, the view at the time was that the astronauts had already been selected. And, what the country needed was science and technology. So the way to get in was not to be one of the handful of people that were selected a long time ago, but to be interested in science, technology, and engineering side. So I never really seriously considered it. But it's funny, after all the stratospheric jump and stuff like that, they just had a round of applications for astronauts, and my friends were encouraging me at the age of 60 to apply. They said, well, who else has experience with spacesuits and high-altitude ballooning and things like that? So I don't know. Maybe the opportunity isn't over. Maybe I'll still send in a resume.
It seems these days they take people from all sorts of backgrounds, different types of sciences and engineering and medical backgrounds and mechanical backgrounds. So you certainly would be well qualified, that's for sure. You originally began preparations for this jump while working at Google, if I got that right, as a Senior Vice President of Knowledge?
That's correct.
What the heck does it mean? I love the title, but help me out here.
Yeah, so we reorganized the company in 2012. In 2012, Larry Page took over as the CEO from Eric Schmidt, and he reorganized the company vertically. And so I had one slice of the company and the products that were in that slice of the company, including both engineering and product management. And so my particular slice of the company included search, it included maps, and included research. But Larry didn't like a title of SVP of search because he really didn't he thought Google should be more than just a search company. He thought Google should know things about what are all the professional football teams? What are all the companies in the world? What are all the relationships between all the entities in the world? And so he decided to change the title from SVP of Search, which implies you're just looking at all the web pages and picking the best one, to VP of Knowledge, which means we as a company know things about the relationships between people and can do a much better job of meeting our users' needs. And so with just a title change, he actually subtly changed the focus of the company, and so I became the VP of knowledge. And the joke was that if I did that job well enough, I'd be the SVP of wisdom as my next progression.
Right.
I retired before that, so it never really happened.
So you've got this great job at Google, and I assume everything's going well there. And then one day in 2011, you decided to pursue this jump from the stratosphere. You just woke up one morning and decided, it's a good time to set a new freefall record. I mean, what possessed you to pursue something like that?
Well, I mean, it was not a eureka moment or anything like that. I had already read pretty much everything that had ever been written about stratospheric skydives. I mean, I grew up as a skydiver. I learned to skydive when I was 18 years old. I consumed part of my life while I was going to school and even graduate school. And then later I learned to fly, and obviously I'm an engineer, more computer science than hard engineering. But I did start as mechanical engineer before I went into computer science. But I've always been fascinated by engineering. So in some sense, I had the prerequisites to do this. And then I had been reading about the various attempts to do high-altitude skydiving, and I just really thought they were approaching it in the wrong way. And there's lots of technical reasons why. Going to a capsule and actually jumping out of a capsule makes things more complicated. But I felt like all the previous approaches has approached it in a way that I did not think was the most effective and efficient, or the safest for that matter. And I thought I had a better idea. And the idea, just to summarize, is using the kind of undersea analogy. Most of these capsules and things are more like a submarine that goes down, and you have a tiny little supply of air to get back to the surface. And in the stratospheric realm, that's a capsule and then a small bailout bottle to allow you to skydive back down into breathable atmosphere. But what happens if you change that? What happens if you think about scuba diving as the analogy? Try to put yourself in a situation where you have everything you need to survive undersea. You've got the oxygen and the wetsuit and all that kind of stuff. And what would the equivalent of scuba diving be in the stratosphere? And so I wanted to approach stratospheric exploration, not from the point of view of capsules, but from the point of view of scuba diving. And that potentially solves a lot of problems that people have in the past. So that was my dream. It wasn't necessarily breaking a free fall record, but what it amounts to is, if you could build a scuba diving for the stratosphere, if you could build something that would allow you to survive in the stratosphere, then you could do anything you want in the stratosphere. I mean, you could do balloon rides to high altitudes in the stratosphere. You could skydive from the stratosphere. You could hang glide in the stratosphere. You could, do highest, sailplane rides up in the stratosphere. So you could do science in the stratosphere. So for me, it was a dream of being self-contained in the stratosphere, never having to worry about the environment that you were in, and being able to apply that to any of the disciplines you might want to do when you're in the stratosphere.
Well, the prior record for high-altitude jump was set by Felix Baumgartner in 2012. Felix's jump had a ton of hype around it. It was sponsored by Red Bull. YouTube video has been seen, I think, over 42 million times. And then you come along, some engineer from Google, flying below the radar, so to speak, little pomp and circumstance, and you break the record. It's an incredible accomplishment that you spent years of your life preparing for. So why did you choose to keep it so quiet? What we were trying to do is basically solve this problem of scuba diving from the stratosphere. We're trying to come up with a technical solution that would make being in the stratosphere safe, and getting down from the stratosphere to Earth safe. And also something that didn't require a lot of expertise. For instance, our design basically said that we have to be able to get an unconscious skydiver down to Earth safely. So in Felix's case, he is an incredible skydiver. Matter of fact, if you look at what he did on that final test, he was in an inverted flat spin at over Mach 1, so over the speed of sound. And he managed, through pretty much a superhuman ability, to basically turn over and stop that spin. Otherwise, it's likely he would have gone unconscious and potentially had serious injuries, maybe even died. But our design was, we want to make it possible for regular people potentially
to be able to survive in the stratosphere. And we certainly wanted to make it 100% safe because, I have a family, I've got, 2 kids. For me, it was really important, to come back safely. So we had a different bent on the whole thing. It was way more about engineering, and it was way less about marketing or testosterone or anything like that. It was more trying to elegantly solve what we thought was an interesting problem.
It's a science experiment for you, essentially.
It was a science experiment, and it was a great science experiment, and there were lots of really interesting problems to solve. And we built an incredible engineering team that, could attack some of these, problems that no one had ever been able to solve before or even tried to solve before. And so for me, that was what it was all about. And we did invite one reporter, John Markoff from the New York Times, who was an old friend of mine. I knew him from Google. And so he was the reporter that was there. So they had like 600 reporters, and we had one. We also thought that if you put a lot of reporters in a place, it actually changes the whole dynamic. Like, I don't know, I've talked a little bit to Art Thompson and Joe Kittinger about what happened with Red Bull, but, in the end, the team was a small minority of the people that were in Roswell that day. They were all on display in some sense by all these reporters, and as a result, I think it changed the dynamic. So for us, when I landed, only the team was there. We celebrated as a team. We put it together as a team. We'd worked 3 years as a team. It felt different because we had achieved the success that we had wanted to do. And it also made us make decisions better. Like, let's say the wind was 1 knot stronger on the ground than we were comfortable with. If we had to send 700 reporters home and wait, some arbitrary amount of time for that, for us to get the right conditions to go again, we might or might not made the right decision there. We might have been pressured to basically go ahead. But, in my case, I funded the effort myself, right? So I could make those decisions. I didn't care whether we went home. We could make safe decisions at every point in the project. And we could also say, look, that test didn't go badly and we need to redesign everything. And we had a test that went badly, and it caused us a year of delay where we redesigned pretty much every system after that because of that test failure. So, for me, not having 1 million people there was a big advantage. And it wasn't a disadvantage because we weren't trying for the publicity anyway.
You certainly don't strike me as having the stereotypical daredevil personality. So I guess that sort of syncs up with this being more of a science experiment, almost an intellectual exercise for you.
Well, I do love the technical aspects of most things. And I like the idea that, with careful planning, the right technology, the right training, the right people, the right way you think about things, you can make things that people would think are dangerous safe. Flying airplanes is like that, right? Airplanes by themselves, if you just let go of them, they're going to crash. It takes planning and discipline and a bunch of other things to be able to safely fly an airplane. Or rock climbing. So a lot of people think rock climbing is very dangerous, and it can be very dangerous. There's certainly people that are pushing the edge in ways that could be dangerous, but many of them have built up a level of experience over time that makes it so that they can do things that other people would be, would feel extremely uncomfortable with. But I've always been somebody that says, well, let's learn how to make something that would appear to be dangerous safe, and let's not push myself that hard. In rock climbing, I love rock climbing. I love being outdoors and things like that. But the routes that I choose are, trivial routes compared to most rock climbers, but they're beautiful. They're outside. I feel very safe. I feel very protected. So, it's not that I don't like doing things that other people would consider dangerous. What I like to do is figure out how to make them safe by being extremely careful and being well trained and other kinds of stuff like that. And it wasn't just an intellectual exercise in some sense. I look back on it now and I think, I had already figured out by myself, the basics, will there be enough oxygen? Can you get a balloon that's that big? How high would you have to go? How much helium would you have to put into it? Could you build a parachute system that would do it? So, there were lots of little elements that I figured out on paper that it looked like it might work. Now, Granted, all of those were wrong. I mean, everything that I assumed that I could do, like the rig, I thought that was going to be very simple, the parachute rig. It turns out we built 11 different versions of that. But on paper, things seemed to held together really well. But if I was smart, I probably would have taken that piece of paper and put it in a drawer, declared success, and said, oh, I don't really need to worry about this anymore. It's a solved problem. But in the end, I didn't just want a paper project. I wanted to see whether it would really work. And I wanted to build a team. I wanted to, build an artifact. I wanted to be the pilot. I wanted to see what it was like to be outside, the Earth's atmosphere and see the darkness of space. So in the end, that transition from a paper project to a real project, that was an important transition. It was an expensive transition too. But in the end, I feel like I learned a lot. And, the team put together an amazing project.
I want to dig into this team a little bit. I mean, you worked with some of these leading experts in all these various fields, including meteorology, ballooning, spacesuit design, environmental systems, high-altitude medicine, just to name a few. I'm sure there are several others. I mean, you're clearly a smart guy, but it's not like your background and expertise at Google had anything to do with these various systems here. So how did you come up the learning curve so you can not just understand these disciplines, but actually manage a team, or even know what kind of team to assemble for that matter?
Well, I mean, in some ways, this team was very different than anything that I'd ever done at Google. But assembling teams was what I did at Google. I mean, in some ways, that's what management is, right? It's assembling teams of people to attack problems that are important to the company. And so, I mean, it was often a case where maybe my boss would come to me and say, I think we need to invest in this area. It's an area I don't know anything about. And so I quickly would have to get up to speed on the area. I'd have to find experts in the area. I'd have to get their opinions on who the best people in the area are. I'd have to try to figure out what level of investment makes sense for this. If I brought them in, how would I attract them to this company, given that that's a specialty that we haven't been known for in the past? And so there were a lot of cases where building teams was important to the company. So I had a lot of experience in that. Now, I didn't have any experience in this particular area, or little experience in this particular area, but I did know some people, and that was important. It's kind of the connection. So the one person that I knew is Peter Diamandis, and from Lunar X Prize and X Prize. He seemed to know a lot of people in the space-related industries because of his X Prize work. And so I told him, basically what I wanted to do. And I said, do you know anybody that's an expert in life support systems for space that could help me try to understand whether what I have on paper is actually possible? And I expected the experts to look at what I had done and pretty much laugh at it, really. But Peter put me in touch with Tabor McCallum from Paragon Space Development Systems. And, he did a little introductory email that, basically said, this guy's not crazy. You should listen to him. And so we set up the first phone call. Turns out Tabor and I are, brothers separated at birth. We both look at things kind of the same way. We both care about the engineering. We're both wildly optimistic about what's possible. We both care about, these kinds of problems. And so we spent a lot of time on the phone. And at the end of it, I expected Tabor to say, you're missing these 5 things that make this impossible. But at the end of that, he said, I really can't see, where the holes are in this. And he said, why don't you come down to Paragon in Tucson, and why don't you meet with the team, and let's, spend a day talking about it. And so I did. I met with the team, and, they had, that company was a perfect match for me because they build suits for toxic environments and environmental systems for spacecraft. Those are their 2 expertise. And so you really couldn't find a better match. And they also had pre-existing relationships with potential suppliers. Like the biggest was the spacesuit. So they actually knew both Dave Clark and had worked with them before, and ILC Dover and worked with them before. So those are the 2 primary suit manufacturers. If I had called either of those 2, they would have hung up on me. But when Paragon called those 2, they had a relationship to start with. And so it made it much easier for us to be able to get those suppliers. And then other people I knew the parachute side. It turns out I used to skydive a very long time ago in DeLand. And DeLand has United Parachute Technologies, which is owned by a guy named Bill Booth. And, I didn't skydive with Bill Booth, I don't think, but I hung around in the drop zone with Bill Booth, certainly knew who he was and had bought much of his equipment. And so when I made a call to United Parachute Technology, there was a connection there. We had figured out who the right balloon person was. And it's funny, I had researched it and come up with one name, and Tabor had researched it and come up with a name. And then when we, basically revealed who that name was, it was the same person. And so anyway, so I went and talked to Julian Knott down in Santa Barbara, and he became our balloon person and led kind of the initial balloon exploration. And then everybody said there's only one person to do the weather, and pointed me at the right person for that, which turned out to be Don Day. And then there was one physician who was a flight surgeon, who was the flight surgeon for Red Bull, who knows high altitude physiology really well. And that was John Clark. It's all these connections. You talk to one person, they know another person, you do a little research, you figure out who's done it before. And what you learn is it's a small community. You have to get into the community, but once you're into the community, everybody knows everybody else in that community.
So between the time you had to take to find these people, interview them, get them on the team, manage the team, test the equipment, all the research you did over the 3-year period, how much time are we talking about?
Well, really, the team was pretty self-sufficient. Paragon led the effort, Tabor and his team. They were the general contractor. So all the subtests were actually done by them. I was involved. There were weekly calls where I'd follow the progress and things like that. And then we had meetings where I would go down. And obviously, if there was a test that I'm involved in, I'd go down. And then I'd do other things like go to the spacesuit fitting in Houston, which they measure like every little piece, like each of the digits of your finger gets measured for the gloves and things like that. But
your personal time, if you look back, was this like an hour a week? Was this a day a week? how much of your life did you devote to this?
It was sporadic. Every week there was at least an hour because there was a call. Early on, there weren't that many visits. Probably once a month, I would have a 2 or 3 day thing that I would have to do, either going to Tucson. And that got bigger. It was probably, later in the project, it was probably about a week a month that I would spend in some test somewhere and things like that.
Let's talk about the jump itself. So you mentioned earlier how you decided to forego the space capsule type of system that Felix had. It was essentially just you and your spacesuit in a helium balloon lifting you up. And the ascent up to the drop point lasted over 2 hours. That is a long time to be floating up. So I'm curious, how did it feel? Were you calm and relaxed, able to take in the views? Were you anxious, afraid in any way?
Well, the background is we had done, over 200 tests for all of this. And as far as we did 5 airplane jumps. The first airplane jump didn't go very well. It took about a year to redesign all the equipment after that first jump. And then after that, we did 4 more airplane jumps. So I was pretty familiar with the suit, flying the suit, what it would feel like in free fall, the opening of the suit, the landings, or as we called them, the crashes on the landings, because they were never elegant. When you've got essentially, 435 pounds, including you, doesn't bend, you're not going to land in a gentle way. But the suit was very protective. So we had already done all of that. And then we had to have a flight testing schedule for balloons. And that's where everything came together, And so the first one of those was our low flight, which was 57,000 feet. Now, 57,000 feet is higher than pretty much any airline can fly. You're now, there's only a few planes that basically can go at 57,000 feet, like the U-2 and the SR-71. But that was the first all-up test. That's where, the release mechanism had to work. That's where the launch happens. That's where, I basically get attached to the balloon. And we had done dummy flights up there, so we kind of knew the release mechanisms and all would work. Of all the, tests, that was the more anxious one, because we had a lot of technology that we had tested independently, but we were bringing it together for the very first time in a manned attempt. So if there was anxiety, it was with that flight, the first one. After that one, the release happened perfectly, the descent happened perfectly, the parachute opened great. We had a great place to land. We had a team that was there almost instantly. 12 seconds after I land, the first person's with me. The chase part of it worked really well. So that really cleaned a lot up. And then we had a second one that was 107,000 feet. And that tested the higher speed configurations we were going to get up. We got up over, probably 500 or 600 miles an hour at that stage. And so in the final jump, the only real change that we had in the whole thing was going to be that we were going to cross the speed of sound. And so that was the one element that we had not done before, except with a dummy. And the dummy did well in crossing the speed of sound. They spent a lot of time more time in the transonic region than I was going to have.
So by the time the jump happened and you're going up for 2 hours, what are you doing then? You're just watching the views?
I was really relaxed. And so I spent a lot of time watching the reviews. I looked at my altimeter a lot to see what altitude we were at. The ground gave me updates along the way. I practiced my emergency procedures and my normal procedures. So if this happens, what do I do? If this happens, what do I do? If this happens and I did this and that doesn't work, what do I do next? So there was a progression of things that I would go over mentally. And honestly, that's the same as a normal skydive. If I'm in a normal skydive in an airplane, one of the things I do is I think about what the skydive that we're doing is and what, my role in that skydive is. But then I also say, well, if the parachute, when it gets time to pull, what am I going to do? And I'm going to wave off, or I'm going to, check the sky, make sure there's no skydivers above me. I'm going to, release the pilot chute. If that parachute doesn't open, what am I going to do? And so really, I had 2 hours to do something that I, practice often. And so that probably took, maybe 10% of my time was just doing that. And the rest of the time was just looking at the views. The last jump was kind of important because I was way higher than I'd been before, which gives you a different perspective on the atmosphere, because you really are looking down on the atmosphere, and you can tell you're looking down on the atmosphere. And I noticed things that I hadn't seen before.
Such as?
You think about clouds as low altitude phenomenon, and they are low altitude. The highest clouds probably get up to 60,000 feet or something like that. So you're over all clouds. What I didn't realize is there are kind of icy cloud-like formations that have like a lacy character that go way up into the atmosphere, like into almost the darkness of space style of atmosphere. You have some of these kinds of kind of lacy. They're not clouds, but you can see them in the various layers of the atmosphere. And I kind of assumed the atmosphere was going to, it was going to be blue, and it was going, to get a little less blue, and a little less blue, and a little less blue, and then black. But what you see when you're actually staring at it for, a couple hours is there's all these really interesting layers inside the atmosphere that you don't think about. That you might maybe never seen before, that no picture has ever displayed that I've seen, because the various light levels are really, really subtle, and even the camera pictures that we took really don't show anywhere near the level of detail that your eye can make out. So I don't know. There was a lot of things to look at. It was much prettier and much more interesting than you might expect it to be, and also you had a lot of you could see pretty far too. In various directions. So I was trying to pick out what sites could I see, how far away they were, and things. And it was funny because there were some sites that I thought I could see, like the Rocky Mountains. It was pretty far away. I wondered whether I could see it or not. At the time, I didn't think I was seeing the Rocky Mountains. But when I came back and reviewed some of the footage, I was actually seeing it. It's just that the Rocky Mountains are so short compared to how high up I was that they didn't look like mountains to me. But when I came back and looked at the footage and then compared it to a Google Earth, that's what it was. So there was a lot of subtleties on the flight up.
With the jump, you used a Drogue Parachute to help stabilize you during the fall, similarly to how they do with tandem skydiving. But the off-the-shelf Drogue Parachutes at the time would have presented a lot of risk to you, so the team had to invent something new from scratch. Talk about that risk a little bit. You sort of alluded to it with Felix's jump, and then what the team came up with to offset it.
So the problem with Drogue parachutes is that there's a a thin window of time, typically, where you throw the drogue out. At the beginning, you're going so slowly that the drogue doesn't have any relative wind, and therefore doesn't act like a drogue at all. It acts like a rope with a piece of fabric on the end of it. And during that time, if you have any motion at all, you could easily get yourself wrapped up in it and entangled. And that's not just an academic exercise. If you look back through history, back in, I think, 1958 or something, Joe Kittinger, when in his first of his attempts at higher and higher stratospheric jumps, he had a timer that was set off to release that drogue. And that timer went off early because he was trying to get out of this capsule, and the capsule had trapped him in the seat. And while he's struggling to get out of that seat, he sets off a timer, and then when he leaves, that timer goes off, and that drogue comes out, 8 seconds earlier than it should have. And so that drogue doesn't have the relative wind that's necessary to extend and keep him from getting tangled. So instead, the drogue bridle wrapped around his neck, he goes into a spin, he goes unconscious, and he wakes up underneath a parachute because they were testing another piece of equipment called an automatic activation device, which was one of the first times that piece of equipment had ever been tested. And it will open a parachute if you can't. And so he was saved by an automatic activation device. So this idea that, that drogue during that period of time could be lethal was proven. So the question is, how do you get a drogue out? If you let it out too early, it can tangle with you. If you let it out too late, there'll be so much relative wind that it will rip it to shreds. So there's only a really small period of time when you could release that drogue and have it be effective. And to make matters worse, the higher you go, that window changes. So when you're low in the atmosphere, that window is really wide. You could get out at 18,000 feet and you could put the drogue out any time and you're probably okay. But when you get up to really high altitude, since you're accelerating so quickly, you're going from 0 miles an hour to, in my case, 822 miles an hour over a period of 50 seconds or something like that. So the trick is, how do you get a drogue out as early as possible? But if it's not effective, how do you protect yourself from it tangling around you? And so the team came up with this amazing idea called the Sabre System. And what a Sabre System does is it takes the drogue and it tacks it down, attaches it to a piece of carbon fiber. And that carbon fiber rolls up into a spool. And so as I fall away, this carbon fiber with the drogue basically unspools from that as I fall away. But rather than remaining flat like it is in the spool, it quickly forms itself into a C shape and forms a pipe, a literal pipe. And that pipe is 10 feet long. So as I fall away, this pipe forms behind me that's 10 feet long, attached to the bridle, and then at the end of that, there's another, say, 8 feet of bridle plus the drogue parachute at the end of that. And so what happens is when I first leave, that drogue doesn't have any wind resistance. So it's just flopping around out there. But it's at the end of a 10-foot pipe, so there's no way it can tangle with me. So that was the miracle of engineering, was to build it in a way that it can't tangle with me. And even more importantly, what happens is when it finally becomes effective, which is probably, maybe 15 seconds into the drop, what happens is it now is pulling at the end of a 10-foot pipe. So there's a huge lever arm that basically is flipping me over and putting me back face to earth. So the combination was super effective. I was supposed to get 29 seconds of weightlessness. So at that point, I could be turning in any direction. But that drogue kept the drogue parachute away from me for the first 17 seconds. And at 17 seconds, it righted me. I was face to earth the whole time on the way down. And, that solved a lot of potential stability problems along the way. So it's just beautiful engineering.
You had mentioned that your speeds clocked upwards of 800 plus miles per hour. Faster than the speed of sound. But when there's no air resistance, do you get any sort of sense as to how fast you're going?
No, zero. The funny thing is that when you leave, there's no sense of anything. There's no noise. you're slowly turning, rotating, so you see the world go by. I mean, one of the really nice things is that was the first jump that I had actually rotated. I had done a backflip, basically, but it was the first time I could see the balloon. So as I turned, I actually watched the big balloon and receding away from it. But it seemed slow that I was receding away from it. There's no sense of, you're so far away from the ground, you can't tell that you're getting closer to the ground. You really feel more like you're floating at that point than anything else. There's no noise at all. And then at some point, the drogue becomes effective. So now you're face to earth. But because of the drogue configuration, you kind of bobble up and down. Your head goes up and then down and then up and then down. And your feet kind of go up and down in this kind of slow pattern. And you're just accelerating. And then what happens is all of a sudden you start to hear a little bit of noise, a little bit of wind resistance. And that, of course, gets bigger and bigger as you get lower and lower, closer and closer to the earth, because you have more and more wind resistance. And eventually you slow down to essentially normal skydiving speeds before you open your parachute.
So paradoxically, it probably feels like you're accelerating, even though you're decelerating.
Yeah, exactly. Because all of a sudden you see this wind, you hear this wind coming by you. But I went back and had to look at the tapes and actually listen to the tapes and then compare it to my actual speed profile on the GPS. And sure enough, the moment I heard the first whisper of wind is when I was slowing down. So the first note of any sound, any wind-related sound, was the indication that I was decelerating the entire rest of the trip down. And before that, when there was no wind, that was the time that I was accelerating.
And when you finally touched down, what did that feel like?
Well, for me, I knew that the touchdown wasn't going to be a big deal. The biggest moment for me was when the parachute opened.
Yeah, that's a helpful thing. Yeah,
at that moment, that was when all the emotion was released. That was when you knew that, you were gonna live. I don't know, you might crash, you could break an arm or something, but at that point, you knew you had been successful in the whole project. And the way we did it is the moment I opened, another plane flew over, and my friend Blickies jumped out next to me, and he actually opened up next to me. So he was flying around me as I'm coming down. He's helping me with things like where the power lines are and things like that, because the visibility was pretty limited. So immediately I had a friend in the sky with me. I had a wingman on the way down, and I could see the helicopters starting to come in, and I could see the trucks descend on where we were going to land. And, the landing area is 70 miles away from where we started. So, you don't necessarily know that your whole team is with you, but at that moment I could see everybody around me, and I could see the landing area. And, that's when it really hit me. And then, of course, I land or crash as the turn, flip over, and I'm fine. I've got a little vegetation patch on my shoulder. And Blickies runs up to me in 10 seconds, and I get the doctors and the suit technicians in, less than a minute after I touch down. And then they open the bubble, and I can breathe the air again, and I see all my friends. I mean, it was a super emotional moment. I mean, it was fantastic. We had done something that no one had ever done before. We had done it with a team that was brand new to this whole process. We'd solved a lot of problems, and I don't know, it was a special moment for me.
Well, despite all the extensive preparations that you and your team took, it was still a highly risky endeavor, and it could have easily cost you your life. There was very little margin for error. And while nobody wishes death upon themselves, of course, and you took all the preparations you could, were you prepared to die for this cause?
Well, if I thought I was going to die, I would not have done it. I really felt like it was safe. It was funny because my wife, she thought I was going to die, and she was worried about it. But I never thought I was going to die. I never thought there was a substantial risk associated with it.
Either do mountain climbers, either do skydivers. I get that there is a lot you're doing to mitigate risk, but there's still an underlying element of risk you can't ever eliminate, right?
It's true that there are things that, could go wrong, but contrast this with mountain climbing, which I love too. I never do really high altitude mountain climbing. I never go to the Himalayas or something like that. Because in mountain climbing, there's a set of things that you can control, and there's a set of decisions that you can control. But the mountain can throw things at you that you did not plan for or could not plan for, like a giant avalanche, okay, or a rock fall, or a crevasse that opens up there's no indication of that crevasse ever. And in each of these cases, some of them you could take precautions for, or the weather could just basically deteriorate so that there's no way you have any visibility anymore. Or so you've got all these things that could happen to you that are out of your control. And you contrast that with this effort where, there are a few of those elements that are there. I mean, it's possible that wind shear at 40,000 feet could basically lop off the top of the balloon. I mean, it's possible, but even then, of course, you're a skydiver, right? You have the ability to get down after that. And, there's automatic opening devices or activation devices. They're going to open the parachute if I can't. There's, we built a spin-resistant system, which took us a long time to figure out and design, that would make sure I did not spin even if I was unconscious. So, kind of funny. My wife made me do all these things before the jump to make me realize that.
Up the life insurance policy?
Yeah. I had to do life insurance. I had to do a living will, all those kinds of things. But she made me do lots more things than that. Like I had to pick the funeral home that was going to make the arrangements. I had to write my own obituary. I had to do all these kinds of things. And her argument was, I understand why you want to do this, and I'm trying to be as supportive as I can as your wife, but I don't want to clean up the mess that you make if something bad happens to you. So I also had to designate a friend of mine, and I wrote him a check, and I said, look, you will plan all the funeral arrangements. I will give you all the details and stuff, but you're going to have to do everything because my wife doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And he's a great friend of mine, and he said, yes, I'll do that for you. And so but the last thing she wanted me to do is to make a video for each of my children saying why I thought this was so important that I was willing to risk my life over it. And they were potentially without a father for the rest of their life after this, which was a really hard video to make. But what was interesting about it is I tried to explain in that video, which no one has ever seen, how careful we had been about the planning. And I really said in the video, I cannot imagine any scenario where I will not survive. I can't imagine any of it. If I did imagine it, I would not be doing this. And it was true. I mean, if there was a scenario which any of us had came up with where there was any risk that a system might not work, because almost every system was redundant. And it's crazy how redundant these systems were, how much I was protected. Like, even in the case, these spacesuits they're really so tight. I mean, no air could get out of these things. The leakage rates are infinitesimally small, and we're talking about micron level holes in the spacesuit. But let's say somebody took a pickaxe and then jammed it right through the outside. So I had a 1/4 inch hole in that spacesuit, and I was at the highest possible point of my jump. We had designed a system that the tanks of oxygen would start dumping oxygen into that so fast that the air could not escape fast enough out of that 1/4 inch hole to basically cause my pressure to get below the level at which my body could survive. And then they would cut me down immediately, and those systems would actually start spinning oxygen in that system all the way down, all the way through the parachute when it opened with or without my control, and all the way to the ground. Even in the wildest possible scenario of a pickaxe in the suit at the highest possible altitude, we had a system that was supposed to keep me safe. Now, we didn't test that system. That, it'd be a tough test to do. But that's the level of confidence that me and the team had in the systems that we were using. So anyway, I wasn't worried about that. I really felt like we had nailed it. I mean, you never know. There's possibly things that we didn't count on, that could, have serious consequences. And the team knew that a mistake is potentially fatal. So the amount of care I can't even tell you how many sleepless nights my team must have had thinking about every possible scenario that would cost me, that could potentially be dangerous to me, and trying to figure out how to mitigate it. So anyway, I was pretty darn confident at the end that the team had done a great job.
Well, when you look back, just to get a little bit philosophical here, you had this incredible, successful career spanning over decades. You're obviously well regarded in your field. And then you embark upon this incredible experiment here. Was there something missing for you in your life? Was there something missing for you in your career that you felt that you needed to fill some sort of void?
I don't know whether I would consider it a void. I mean, my career had been excellent. I had got to work with, some of the best people in the world and learned a lot from them during that period of time. I think for me, it was more like I had this idea that you could safely spend time in the stratosphere and that you could explore the stratosphere in a way that no one had ever done it before. And the real question for me was, what am I going to do with that idea? It's just like any other idea that you have. You can either decide to put it in a drawer and leave it there for the rest of your life and wonder at the end of your life, wonder what would have happened if I had done that. Or you can explore it and keep kind of exploring it. And then at some point you have to ask yourself, am I just going to let it go? And then you have to ask yourself later on in life, you have to say, am I going to regret this decision for the rest of my life? Am I going to regret the fact that I had a chance to do something? I had a chance to build a team. I had a chance to learn all about this. I had a chance to push the envelope on a lot of really interesting technologies. Or am I going to sit back and watch television, kind of thing? And, in the end, it's a personal decision. Everybody makes it based on what their financial situation is and what their family situation is. And, in the end, I decided that I didn't want to regret it for the rest of my life. I wanted to pursue it. And if I failed at it, that's fine, right? At least I tried. But, for me, just to sit around and say, I could have done it and I never did, I don't know. That wasn't a satisfying answer to me. So anyway, I went for it.
So what's next? Any other big, audacious science experiments you're thinking about?
Not really. I mean, my wife and I kind of have a deal that I'm not going to do any more stratospheric adventures. Although my plan was to do all kinds of stratospheric adventures. I mean, once you have the suit,
you've got the suit.
You can do anything, right? I mean, if I want to do the highest hang glider flight in the world, I just basically take my suit, strap it to a hang glider, go up to, 75,000 feet and have this wonderful experience in a hang glider of flying higher than anyone else has done. Or, if I wanted to do the balloon flight up and down, you don't get balloon records if you go up to the top and then you skydive out. You have to land the balloon basically to get a balloon record. But I intended to do that and sailplane records and all kinds of stuff. So I really had a whole long list. But, that didn't work out so well. My wife was going to divorce me if I kept on this path. So that was one problem. And the second problem is the team, when I landed, they wanted, I think, this experience for themselves and for their friends. So they started a space tourism company that's based on the idea of flying a balloon up to altitude, maybe 100,000 feet rather than 135,000 feet, but having a fully open ram air parachute, a square parachute underneath it. And so when you release, you're now underneath a parachute. Not free falling at the speed of sound. And they thought there'd be a lot of people that might be interested in space tourism, where the way up you're in a beautiful pressurized environment and with a lounge and alcohol and a bathroom and all that, but to see the kind of things I did. So anyway, so my wife was going to divorce me. The team had set out on this new goal of building a team called Worldview. And then the suit was donated to the Air and Space Museum in Washington. So anyway, in the end, I wouldn't have a marriage, I didn't have a team, and I didn't have a suit. So I don't know. I was grounded for quite a while after that.
Alan, the name of this podcast is called The Art of Excellence. What's your definition of excellence?
I don't know. Excellence, it's a complicated topic. Excellence is approaching a problem and really trying to find the best possible way through it, the simplest possible way, the most elegant possible way. It's optimizing a problem to the extreme, and whether that's running a company or whether that's, a particular product or whether it's a particular goal or whether it's a particular adventure, it's how much you pay attention to all the various details, how you put it together, how you put a team together. How well do you solve a problem in an elegant way? To me, that's kind of the definition of excellence. It's not brute force, right? Brute force is just throwing, people, time, energy, whatever at some problem. But the difference between success and excellence is kind of the journey and the details. And the people that I know that I really feel like are excellent are the ones that think harder about the problems than anybody else. They're willing to experiment with lots of different solutions to problems. They're watching carefully what everyone else has done, and they're trying to figure out what the right way is. Anyway, that's my definition.
I like that. It strikes me as I'm listening to this, because I know you had one or two startups in you before Google, and this was essentially a startup, right? But rather than the end goal being to build up value and sell it, the value is just in the learning itself. You weren't even after fame or fortune or publicity. It was just for the sheer sake of learning and being a part of something great. And I think that's what makes this story so remarkable to me.
Well, thank you. That's really nice of you.
This has been a fascinating journey. One of my favorite interviews for sure. And I can't thank you enough for being a part of this.
Oh, no, I'm happy to be there. Happy to share it with you.
Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can subscribe to the show at iTunes, Stitcher, and theartofexcellence.com. I've got one small favor to ask. If you like the show, please take a minute and leave us a review on iTunes. I would really appreciate that. I'll see you next time.